Welcome back to the show as we continue our discussion on freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. In the last few months, U.S. warships have entered Chinese territorial waters near its islands in the South China Sea, and China has strongly condemned those actions. Joining me now from Beijing is Hailin. He is the director of the Center for South Asia Studies with the Chinese Academy of Social Science. Also joining us from Austin, Texas is Ted Carpenter. He is a senior fellow for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the CATO Institute. And with us from Lancashire in England is Keyuan Zou. He is a professor of international law at the University of Central Lancashire, and he is an expert on maritime law. Welcome to all of you to the show. Hailin, let me start with you. President Barack Obama, the US president, is currently in Vietnam, and while he was in Vietnam, on this issue of the South China Sea, he said, and I'm quoting here, "In the South China Sea, the United States is not a claimant in current disputes, but we will stand with our partners in upholding key principles like freedom of navigation." Hailin, what do you think the president meant by that? Was that some kind of a threat?
I think this is a long-term stance of the United States, but it's really difficult for China to accept such kind of the statement. Firstly, China doesn't think this American didn't pick up the side on the South China Sea dispute. In China's perspective, United States already pick up the side to stay with the Philippines, and to stay with the Vietnam is still a little bit far from the current status, but to stay with the Philippines is obviously, actually all the documents Philippines provided to the arbitral tribunal is prepared by the United States, so it's very obviously. And secondly, so-called the freedom of navigation FON. In China's perspective, also has a lot of things need to be argued. Firstly, there is no any other country, no any other company has ever complained their commercial ship was blocked or harassed during the South China Sea dispute. So the freedom of the navigation never be a problem. Secondly, Americans' freedom of navigation is only military aspect, and that means not the freedom of the navigation, it's a freedom of espionage. Americans send their ship and a plane to collect the Chinese information and intelligence. Obviously, China won't accept such kind of the activity and operation is harmless to Chinese security. And thirdly, we know before the 2014, China didn't deploy any weapon in the Nansha Island or Nansha Island. But till now, China do deploy some weapons. It's because of such kind of the freedom of the navigation. So that's the reason why, in Chinese perspective, such kind of the action make the situation even worse and more tense.
Ted, the Chinese government has already said that these operations pose what it calls political and military provocations. Now, we've just heard President Obama say that we will stand with our partners, and this, of course, comes just after the lifting of the arms embargo against Vietnam. What is the message the U.S. is sending here, and what is the motivation for carrying out these operations?
Well, I think the context is extremely important. The fact that the United States insists that it is not taking sides in the territorial claims, but this comes at a time when the United States is lifting the arms embargo against Vietnam. It emphasizes its obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines. The freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea have to be examined within that larger context. The U.S. insists that it is not taking sides, but U.S. actions suggest otherwise. In my view, the freedom of navigation patrols constitute a solution in desperate search of a problem. There really has not been interference with navigation, and to be in China's face in this way with these patrols, I think is needlessly provocative. We do have to be cognizant of the fact that the South China Sea is very much in China's neighborhood. If we wanted to reverse this, we would expect China to be restrained if there were territorial disputes involving the Gulf of Mexico, something that was very close to the United States. This is an issue that cries out for caution and restraint on the part of the United States. So far, that has not been entirely evident with regard to U.S. policy.
So then, Ted, does China have a point when it says that it views these operations as political and military provocations?
I think the actions are at the very least insensitive. Now, having said that, I would take the position that China's claims in the South China Sea are overly broad, overly ambitious. They cry out for a compromise, but such compromises need to be negotiated between China and rival claimants. The United States should not be a party to these disputes.
Right.
But China perhaps needs to be more flexible in its policies as well.
Professor Zou, what is the legal position that the United States asserts or invokes when it carries out these freedom of navigation operations?
Because as we know that the United States launched the Freedom of Navigation program in 1979 before the adoption of the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and to challenge, as I know, three kinds of so-called excessive claims. The first one is the strait baselines, and in the United States, if the strait baselines are excessive, then they send a military vessel there to challenge it. And the second is the innocent passage, because the innocent passage through the coastal, the territorial waters of the coastal state is reserved in the law of the sea. But there's a controversial whether innocent passage can be allowed for warships. So the United States challenged that, and as manifested in the South China Sea recently, and the U.S. American warships they passed through the territorial waters of China in the South China Sea. The third one is the military activities in the exclusive economic zone and EZ. And this is also a controversial issue whether the foreign military activities can be allowed under international law to be conducted within the EZ of a coastal state. So these three kinds of challenges the United States they're doing. And the legal basis for the United States, because as we know that the United States is not a party to the UNCLOS, but it's a party to the 1958 Geneva Conventions on the Law of the Sea. So they may use the Geneva Conventions as a legal basis. But the problem is here is, to my view, and if the United States use the freedom of navigation, the freedom of navigation is not unlimited freedom. It's a limited freedom, and it is also depends on in what maritime areas. For example, the freedom of navigation only exercised on the high seas, and to some extent and can be exercised in the EZ, but there's no freedom of navigation within the territorial waters of a coastal state. Right. So there's nothing about the freedom of navigation in the territorial sea.
Right. That treaty that you refer to there is UNCLOS, you called it. That's the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And we should point out, as you pointed out, that the United States has neither signed nor ratified that treaty. Hailin, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman said that China has always respected and supported real freedom of navigation in accordance with international law and is firmly opposed to all acts that harm China's sovereignty and security interests under the name of freedom of navigation. So when we see these operations being carried out by the United States Navy, what is it actually doing in the region?
Actually, in Chinese understanding, the Americans' freedom of navigation in military aspect is try to make the regional situation even more tense. And in the Chinese understanding, actually, the freedom of navigation means the innocent passive. So it doesn't mean that any one country, any other country has the right to send their warship to the territory, maritime, or any other country's territory sea, or the EEZ to launch some not so innocent operation. China not only oppose the Americans' deployment and sailing in the Chinese territorial water, but also the nature of such kind of operation means to collect the information and collect the intelligence and so on. So it's on the two key points. One is whether it's innocent. Other one is whether it's only the passive, or they also conduct some another actions. So in this case, China opposed the Americans' freedom of navigation. But meanwhile, I would like to emphasize one point, that when China launched a similar operation towards United States also complained to China. This not only to the not means the Chinese warship to the close water of the United States as a continent, but also when China sends some information or the surveillance ship to the military drill launched by the United States and its alliance, America also opposed and also against such kind of the so-called unprofessional. So that means what America did to China, and China complained that actually if China do the same thing, America will also complain.
Ted, make for us the distinction between commercial ships and warships. China has suggested that the United States should make that distinction. Should it?
I think it's a legitimate distinction. Commercial ships are, by their very nature, unthreatening to another power in the region. Warships, by their very nature, can be menacing. And I think for China especially, to see American warships sailing into waters very close to China, there is an inherent menace in that action. Even if that is not necessarily intentional on the part of the United States, the gesture itself will be seen by the Chinese people and the Chinese government as menacing. And U.S. officials need to be sensitive to that point, that when you're in the neighborhood of another great power, whether it is China or some other great power, you need to act in a circumspect way. You need to be sensitive to that kind of perspective, that having your warships operate in that fashion is going to be seen as threatening. And we need to avoid gestures that can be seen as deeply unfriendly. There is no need for the United States to be having armed patrols in the South China Sea at this point in time. And this was a policy that was almost certain to cause friction in the U.S.-Chinese relationship.
Professor Zou, would it help if the United States did sign the UNCLOS Treaty, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, if it did sign it and ratify it? Would that help?
I'm not sure whether United States is going to sign or ratify the UNCLOS, but the UNCLOS is a convention not ratified by 157 countries, including the European Union, and it is called a Constitution for the Oceans. And of course, many countries, they abide by, including China, they abide by the relevant provisions of the UNCLOS. But sometimes it is, we should be aware that because international law in nature is weak legal system in comparison with the domestic legal systems.
Right.
There is no national law enforcing agency above the sovereign states. So that is the weakness lies in the international law enforcement. So that is why the international law sometimes is abused by some states in terms of the Law of the Sea Convention, and some countries they use the easy provisions to claim islands and reefs in the South China Sea. That is abuse, one abuse. The second abuse is manifested by the Philippines recent initiated arbitration case,
right,
and used the relevant provisions to illegally and unlawfully initiate the arbitration case. So that is, of course, the United States is not a party,
right,
but the United States also used the UNCLOS to enhance its military presence in the South China Sea. So that is another kind of excessive, abusive undertaking. So that is very regret for the international law perspective.
Okay. Hailin, there are some analysts who say that these disputes in the South China Sea are not just legal disputes, that they're part of what they term a geostrategic contest between these two powers. So when you look at it that way, what is the motivation then for the U.S. actions?
I think in Chinese understanding, Americans, including their freedom of navigation, is also want to ensure his maritime supremacy over the South China Sea. Americans want to maintain its role as a rule maker in the South China Sea. So America also encouraged China to solve the problem with the Philippines, with Vietnam, but under the supervision of the United States, under the term provided by the United States. It's not only a matter of the legal system, but all the sovereignty issue, but also the order issue. So that means Americans now see China as a challenger to the current maritime situation, and Americans want to ensure the current system could be fulfilled by the United States, by the freedom of navigation. So it's already beyond the territorial dispute. It's related to the regional system and the international order in this region. So there's in this context, actually the situation even going to more dangerous compared with only the sovereignty dispute. Because if you want to solve the sovereignty dispute, you can launch the bilateral negotiation or bargaining or contact or discussion. But if something involve the maritime supremacy, it's basically a zero-sum game. At least, if Americans start to see China as a competitor, it will be turned into a zero-sum game.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.